A black man never imagined that stopping to help a stranger on the side of the road would change his life. For years he had convinced himself that second chances weren't meant for men like him, men with pasts too heavy to escape. Stuck in a dead-end job, living paycheck to paycheck, he had long since given up on the dreams he once had. But one simple act of kindness sets off a chain of events he never saw coming. When a wealthy businessman shows up at his door with an offer he can't refuse, he realizes that maybe, just maybe, his story isn't over yet. In the quiet outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia, where the streets were lined with modest homes and the distant hum of traffic from the city echoed through the night, Deshaun Carter lived a life of quiet resilience. At 55, he had seen more hardship than most. His hands, rough and calloused from years of labor, told the story of a man who had fought his way through life, battling demons, both external and internal. He was a man who had learned the hard way that second chances didn't come easy, and for people like him, they rarely came at all. Deshaun had been born into struggle. His childhood home had never been a place of warmth or comfort, it had been a battleground. His father, a man with a temper as fierce as his grip on a bottle, had ruled with an iron fist, while his mother, too lost in her own addiction, had been nothing more than a shadow in the background. Nights were filled with the sounds of shattering glass, raised voices, and the occasional thud that sent shivers down his spine. By the age of 10, Deshaun had learned that love, in his household, was something conditional, something that came and went like the flickering light of a dying bulb. But fate, in its cruel indifference, had other plans. The night the police had shown up at his door, after a neighbor finally decided enough was enough, should have been the beginning of something better. Instead, it was just another chapter in his story of displacement. Foster care had been no salvation. Moved from house to house, from one indifferent guardian to another, Deshaun had learned early that no one was coming to save him. No one was going to hold his hand through the storm. By the time he was 16, he had stopped waiting. With no one to steer him right, Deshaun had found solace in the streets. The gang had been more than just a crew, it had been family. A twisted, dangerous family, but a family nonetheless. It had given him a sense of belonging, a purpose, even if that purpose had led him down a path of crime, addiction, and self-destruction. By 20, he was already lost in the haze of drugs and the adrenaline of fast money. By 30, he had hit rock bottom. The night his wife, the only good thing he had ever known, had died in a car accident while he was locked away in a rehab facility, was the night Deshaun realized that life had stripped him of everything. The streets had given him something, but they had taken even more. So he had made a choice. It had taken years, painful, grueling years, to claw his way back, to rid his body of the poison he had once relied on, to silence the ghosts that whispered temptations in the dead of night. And though he had won that battle, the war had left him scarred. He had lost his wife, lost any hope of reconnecting with his estranged son, lost the dreams of a life he had once envisioned for himself. What he was left with was a simple, quiet existence. A job delivering food from a small restaurant on the south side of Atlanta. A tiny apartment with a leaking faucet and a fridge that was never full but never empty. And one true friend, Raymond Johnson, the old war veteran who lived just down the street. Raymond was the only person who had ever truly believed in him. He had been the one to get Deshaun his job, the one to remind him, time and time again, that he was more than his past. They spent their evenings on Raymond's porch, watching the sun dip behind the rooftops, sharing stories that were equal parts tragedy and wisdom. It was Raymond who knew Deshaun's deepest secret, the one he barely admitted to himself, that deep down he still had dreams. Despite everything, Deshaun had never let go of his love for cars. Before life had swallowed him whole, he had spent his teenage years working in an old auto shop, learning the ins and outs of engines, transmissions, and the satisfying hum of a well-tuned machine. He had always dreamed of working in the logistics industry, maybe even becoming a warehouse manager, overseeing shipments, keeping things running smoothly. He had the skills, he just didn't have the opportunity. No one wanted to take a chance on an ex-convict with a past like his. So he had settled. He told himself that delivering food was enough, that making ends meet was all that mattered. But in the quiet of the night, when the world was still and the memories crept in, he knew he wanted more. He just didn't believe he would ever get it. It was too late for a man like him to be out on the roads unless he was working. The air was thick with the remnants of the humid Georgia summer, and the streets were quiet, save for the occasional flicker of headlights cutting through the darkness. Deshawn had just finished his shift, the last few deliveries taking him farther than usual, and all he wanted now was to get home, take off his shoes, and let the weight of the day slip away. But as he turned onto the dimly lit stretch of highway leading to his neighborhood, something caught his eye. A car pulled over on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking against the empty road. At first he told himself to keep driving. It wasn't his problem. He had places to be, a bed to get to, and besides, stopping to help strangers in the middle of the night was a good way to end up on the morning news as a cautionary tale. But as he got closer, he saw her, a young woman, probably in her late 20s, crouched by the car, a cell phone wedged between her ear and her shoulder, struggling with a tire iron that was clearly too stubborn for her to handle. She was alone, and from the way she kept glancing around nervously, she knew as well as he did that this wasn't the safest place to be stranded. Deshawn sighed, running a tired hand over his face before pulling his truck to a stop a few feet behind her. "Shit," he muttered under his breath. He wasn't sure if this was a good idea, but his mama, despite all her flaws, had at least taught him one thing: you don't leave people stranded if you can help it. He gave his horn a quick honk, just enough to let her know someone was there, then stepped out of the truck, keeping his movements slow, non-threatening. He knew how it looked, a black man approaching a lone woman in the middle of the night. He had learned long ago that the world wasn't always kind to men who looked like him, no matter their intentions. "Hey there," he called out, keeping his voice even, calm. "You need some help." The woman snapped her head toward him, eyes wide with that initial flash of fear he was all too familiar with. But then she took him in his work uniform. The tired lines on his face, the way he stood just far enough away to let her decide whether she wanted his help or not. She hesitated, then let out a frustrated sigh. "Yeah, actually, this damn thing won't budge." Deshawn nodded, stepping closer. "Mind if I take a look?" She gave a small, cautious nod, stepping aside as he crouched down beside the car. The tire was completely shot, a long, wicked gash running through the rubber. No fixing that. He grabbed the jack from her trunk and started working, his hands moving with a kind of ease that came from years of experience. "Looks like you picked up something nasty on the road," he said, glancing up at her as he loosened the lug nuts. "You got a spare?" She nodded, gesturing toward the trunk. "Yeah, just didn't think I'd have to actually use it." Deshawn chuckled. "Tires don't care what you think." A small, relieved laugh escaped her, and for the first time, some of the tension in her shoulders eased. He could tell she was still wary, but she was letting herself trust him, at least a little. As he worked, she hovered nearby, arms crossed over her chest, watching him with a mix of curiosity and lingering nerves. "So, you a mechanic or something?" she asked after a moment. "Nah," Deshawn replied, shaking his head. "Used to work in a shop when I was younger, though. Learned a thing or two." She nodded, watching as he effortlessly maneuvered the spare tire into place. "So what do you do now?" He exhaled through his nose, tightening the bolts with careful precision. "Deliver food. Pays the bills." Something in his voice must have given him away, because she tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Not exactly your dream job, huh?" Deshawn smirked, but there wasn't much humor in it. "Not exactly." She waited, as if giving him space to decide whether he wanted to say more. And maybe it was the late hour, or maybe it was the fact that she was a stranger, someone who didn't know him, didn't know his past, didn't look at him with the weight of old mistakes in her eyes, but he told her. Told her about how he used to love working on cars, how he'd always wanted to do something with it. Told her how he had dreamed of working in logistics, maybe managing a warehouse, making sure things ran smoothly, building something stable. Told her how life had a way of closing doors before you even had the chance to walk through them. She listened. Really listened. Not the kind of listening people did when they were just waiting for their turn to speak, but the kind that made you feel like your words actually mattered. "That's tough," she said after a moment. "Yeah," Deshawn muttered, double-checking the bolts. "But it is what it is." She was quiet for a moment. Then, what if it isn't? He looked up at her, brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, as if she wasn't sure she should say what was on her mind. But then she shrugged, giving him a small, almost teasing smile. "Maybe life's not done with you yet." Deshawn huffed out a laugh, shaking his head as he stood. That's so. Yeah, she said, nodding toward the now fixed tire. I mean, look at you. Out here saving stranded drivers at midnight. If life was really done with you, I'd probably still be stuck on the side of this road. He let out a low chuckle, dusting his hands off on his pants. Well, lucky you then. She smiled, then reached into her bag, pulling out a wallet. Seriously, let me give you something for your trouble. Deshawn immediately shook his head, holding up a hand. Nah, don't do it for that. She hesitated, then tucked the wallet away, something thoughtful flickering across her face. All right, but at least let me say thank you properly. He nodded. That I'll take. She held out her hand. Vanessa. He took it, shaking it firmly. Deshawn. Well, Deshawn, she said, stepping back toward her car, I really do appreciate it. No problem, he said, watching as she climbed into the driver's seat. She rolled down the window, giving him one last look. And hey, don't count yourself out just yet. With that, she drove off into the night, leaving Deshawn standing there, the words lingering in the air long after her taillights disappeared. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face before heading back to his truck. He didn't know why, but something about that conversation stuck with him. Maybe it was the way she had listened, or the way she had spoken with such quiet certainty, like she knew something he didn't. He shook his head, climbing into the driver's seat and turning the key in the ignition. It was just a conversation. Just another late-night encounter on another long day. And yet, as he pulled onto the road and headed home, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that somehow it mattered. The next morning, Deshawn woke up to the same routine he had settled into for years. He stretched out the stiffness in his back, rolled his shoulders, and let out a long breath as he sat on the edge of his bed. Sunlight leaked through the blinds in thin, golden streaks, casting shadows across the small, cluttered room. It was his day off, which meant he had nowhere to be, no orders to deliver. No customers impatiently waiting for their food. Just another quiet day, like all the others. He moved through the motions, boiling a pot of coffee that was a little too strong, stepping out onto his small porch to breathe in the warm Georgia air, watching as the world around him slowly came to life. The usual sounds filled the morning cars rolling down the street, kids playing a few houses down, someone mowing their lawn, even though it was already too damn hot for all that. It was familiar, predictable. But something about today felt different. It wasn't until he was sitting on his couch, flipping through channels without really watching anything, that he heard the knock at the door. Not the heavy, rhythmic pounding of Raymond, who never bothered with subtlety, but something softer, more deliberate. Deshawn frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. Raymond was probably still at the VFW hall, and the only people who ever knocked on his door unannounced were either selling something or trying to save his soul. The knock came again. Pushing himself up, he made his way to the door, unlocking it with one hand while adjusting his shirt with the other. When he pulled it open, the sight waiting for him on the other side made him pause. A man stood on his porch, dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, the fabric pressed so cleanly it almost looked like it had never seen a wrinkle. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that told Deshawn he wasn't a man used to hearing the word no. But it wasn't just the suit or the polished leather shoes that set him apart, it was the car parked just beyond the driveway. A Cadillac Escalade, black, spotless, the kind of car that people with money drove. Deshawn narrowed his eyes slightly, instinct kicking in. He had seen men like this before, back in the day, the kind that only showed up when they wanted something. The man studied him for a moment before offering a polite, businesslike nod. Deshawn Carter. Deshawn's fingers twitched slightly on the doorknob. Who's asking? The man gave a small, knowing smile, as if he had expected that response. Marcus Williams. He extended a hand. Vanessa's brother. That name hit Deshawn like a sudden gust of wind, knocking loose something in his chest. He blinked, caught off guard, before glancing past Marcus toward the Escalade. For a split second, he half expected Vanessa to step out of it, but the passenger seat was empty. Deshawn shifted his weight, glancing back at Marcus. Vanessa sent you. Marcus nodded. She told me what happened last night. Said she got a flat on the highway, and some guy stopped to help her change it. Said he didn't ask for anything in return, just did it because it was the right thing to do. Deshawn shrugged. Wasn't a big deal. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. To you, maybe, but to her, it was. Deshawn didn't know what to say to that, so he just stood there, waiting for whatever was coming next. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small white envelope, holding it out. She wanted me to give you this. Deshawn didn't take it. His eyes flicked between the envelope and Marcus, his jaw tightening slightly. Look, man, I don't need. It's not about need, Marcus interrupted smoothly. It's about gratitude. Deshawn let out a slow breath, staring at the envelope. He already knew what was inside, could feel the weight of it just by looking at the way it pressed against Marcus's fingers. Money. And probably not just a few bills. This was the kind of envelope that changed people's weeks, maybe even their months. And yet, his first instinct was to push it right back. I appreciate it, he said carefully, his voice steady, measured, but I didn't help her for this. Marcus studied him for a long moment, as if trying to gauge whether he was serious. Then, instead of pulling the envelope back, he simply nodded. I figured you'd say that. Deshawn frowned slightly. Then why? Because she would have kicked my ass if I didn't at least try, Marcus said, a hint of amusement flickering in his dark eyes. Deshawn exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. She that stubborn? You have no idea. For the first time since opening the door, Deshawn felt the tension in his shoulders ease just slightly. Marcus wasn't just some rich guy handing out charity. There was something in the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, that felt real. Like he wasn't here out of obligation, but because he actually wanted to be. Still, Deshawn wasn't about to take money for something he had done just because it was the right thing to do. Marcus seemed to pick up on that, because instead of pushing the envelope again, he did something else. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. If you don't want the money, that's fine, Marcus said, holding the card between two fingers. But I've got a better offer. Deshawn arched a brow, skeptical but intrigued. Yeah? Marcus nodded. Vanessa told me you used to work on cars. Said you wanted to get into logistics, maybe even warehouse management. Deshawn's stomach tightened. He hadn't thought much about that conversation since last night, hadn't expected anything to come from it. But here this man was, standing on his porch, saying words Deshawn had long since stopped believing he'd ever hear. I run a logistics company, Marcus continued. We've got an opening. It comes with 3 months of paid training. After that, full-time position, benefits, a real shot at something solid. Deshawn stared at him, not quite believing what he was hearing. Marcus smirked slightly. You've got the experience. You just never had the opportunity. Consider this one. Deshawn looked down at the business card, hesitating for just a moment before reaching out and taking it. The thick cardstock pressed against his fingertips, the name Williams Freight Logistics printed in bold letters across the top. A real job, not just a gig, not just something to get by. A real chance. For a long moment, he said nothing. His mind caught between the past that had shaped him and the future that, for the first time in a long time, felt like it might actually be possible. Finally, he let out a quiet breath and looked up at Marcus. Tell me more. Marcus leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching Deshawn with that same unreadable expression, measuring, calculating. Not in a way that felt manipulative, but in a way that suggested he had done this before. Offered people things. Tested whether or not they would take them. And Deshawn could tell, just from the way Marcus carried himself, that he wasn't a man who wasted time on things that didn't matter. So, when Deshawn said, "Tell me more," Marcus nodded once, like he had been waiting for those exact words. Our main warehouse is just outside the city, he started, his voice smooth, businesslike, but not cold. We handle regional freight distribution, moving inventory between suppliers, managing shipments, keeping things running on schedule. It's not glamorous, but it's solid work. The kind that keeps the economy moving, even if most people don't think about it. Deshawn rubbed his chin, considering. And you're saying you got an opening? Marcus's mouth quirked at the corner. Not just an opening. A chance. There's a management position coming up, warehouse floor operations. It's hands-on, overseeing shipments, making sure inventory is processed correctly, handling logistics for outgoing freight. You'd be working with a team, but you'd be in charge of the day-to-day. Training lasts 3 months. After that, if you're good, you're in. Deshawn let out a slow breath, his fingers curling around the business card. He felt the weight of it in his palm, heavier than it should been, not because of what it physically was, but because of what it represented. "You don't even know me," he said after a moment. "What makes you think I can do the job?" Marcus studied him. "Vanessa doesn't stop talking about people unless they make an impression." Deshawn huffed. "She barely knows me." "Maybe. But she listened. Said you knew your way around cars, understood systems, knew how things worked. And from what she told me, you're the kind of guy who doesn't walk away from a problem just because it's not his to fix." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "That's rare." Deshawn looked away for a second, exhaling through his nose. He wasn't sure if he liked hearing himself described that way. He had spent most of his life believing that people didn't expect much from him, that whatever image they had in their heads was already decided the moment they saw him: big, black, a man with a past. But now, here was this stranger, talking to him like he was someone worth investing in. Marcus must have picked up on the hesitation, because he pushed off the doorframe, standing straight. "Look, I don't expect an answer right now, but I do expect you to at least think about it." He pulled another card from his pocket, this one with a direct number written across the back. "If you're serious, call me. We'll set up a meeting." Deshawn took the card, rolling it between his fingers. He glanced at the Cadillac parked in his driveway, then back at Marcus. "What's in it for you?" he asked finally. Marcus gave a short, quiet laugh, shaking his head. "Man, not everything's a hustle." Deshawn arched a brow. "Rich guy showing up at my door, offering me a job out of nowhere. Feels like a hustle." Marcus smirked. "Fair, but this isn't charity. It's business. Good people are hard to find, and I got a feeling you might be one of them." Deshawn didn't say anything. Marcus let the silence sit for a moment, then stepped back. "Think it over," he said, turning toward the car. "But don't take too long. Opportunities don't wait forever." Deshawn watched as he pulled open the driver's side door and slid in. The engine hummed to life, smooth, expensive, powerful. Marcus didn't peel out or speed away, he just pulled off like a man who had done what he came to do and didn't need to press the issue. Deshawn stood there, watching the taillights disappear down the street, the card still clutched in his hand. He had been offered things before. Second chances, fresh starts, ways to make something of himself. But they had always come with conditions, a price to pay, strings attached. And yet this felt different. He went back inside, shutting the door behind him. He set the card on the table, staring at it for a long moment before shaking his head and walking away. He needed time to think. But deep down, he already knew. Something had just changed, and this time he wasn't sure he could ignore it. Deshawn spent the next 2 days pretending he wasn't thinking about it. He told himself he was too old to be chasing new opportunities. That guys like him didn't just stumble into good things without some kind of catch. He had lived long enough to know that the world didn't hand out favors, especially not to men with his past. So, he stuck to his routine, woke up early, drank his bitter coffee, and went about his day as if Marcus Williams and his business card had never shown up on his doorstep. But the truth was, he couldn't shake it. It sat there, lodged in the back of his mind, gnawing at him in quiet moments while he was out on deliveries, while he was sitting on Raymond's porch listening to the old man ramble about the past, while he was lying awake in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling like something inside him was shifting, tilting. And no matter how much he tried to push it down, there was a voice, low, steady, impossible to ignore. What if this is it? What if this is the chance you've been waiting for? By the 3rd day, Deshawn stopped fighting it. That morning, he woke up before the sun, sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, and stared at the business card sitting in front of him. The edges were slightly curled from where he'd been flipping it between his fingers for the past hour. He had read the name a dozen times, Marcus Williams, Williams Freight Logistics, but it still felt unreal, like something that belonged to someone else's life. He let out a slow breath, reached for his phone, and dialed the number. Marcus picked up after the first ring. "Thought I wasn't going to hear from you," he said, and Deshawn could hear the smile in his voice. "Yeah, well," Deshawn exhaled through his nose, rubbing the back of his neck. "Guess I'm calling." Marcus didn't gloat, didn't hit him with an "I told you so." He just said, "Good. Let's set up a time for you to come in." 2 days later, Deshawn found himself standing outside a massive warehouse on the outskirts of Atlanta, feeling like he didn't belong. The place was bigger than anything he had ever worked in before, a massive industrial space with rows of loading docks and the constant buzz of forklifts moving between towering stacks of inventory. Workers in reflective vests moved with purpose, scanning shipments, checking manifests, directing trucks to the right bays. It was organized chaos, but it worked, every piece moving in sync, every person playing a role. Marcus met him out front, dressed in a sharp button-down and slacks, looking like he had already been there for hours. He gave Deshawn a nod, then led him inside, giving him the rundown as they walked. "This is where it happens," Marcus said, gesturing to the open warehouse floor. "We handle distribution for a lot of major suppliers. Everything that comes in has to be logged, sorted, and shipped back out on schedule. No room for mistakes. You think you can handle that?" Deshawn eyed the workers moving in and out of the loading docks. "Looks like a lot." Marcus shrugged. "It is. But I've got a feeling you can keep up." They went over the details, the training schedule, the expectations, the pay. It was good money. Better than anything Deshawn had made in years. Stability. Benefits. A real future. But what stuck with him most wasn't the numbers, it was the way Marcus spoke to him. Like he was capable. Like he was someone worth betting on. After an hour of walking the warehouse, Marcus turned to him, arms crossed. "So, you in or not?" Deshawn let out a slow breath. He thought about the years he had wasted, the jobs that had barely kept him afloat, the way he had convinced himself that this scraping by, just getting through the day, was all he deserved. He thought about Vanessa's words that night on the highway, the way she had looked at him like she saw something in him that even he couldn't see. He thought about Marcus, standing here now, offering him something real. And for the first time in a long time, he decided he wasn't going to walk away from it. "I'm in." 4 months later, Deshawn's life didn't just look different, it felt different. He had gone through the training, learned the ins and outs of the operation, proven himself in ways he hadn't thought he could. He worked harder than he ever had, but for the first time it didn't feel like he was just grinding to survive. It felt like he was building something. With his new paycheck, he moved out of his rundown apartment into a place that actually felt like home. Nothing fancy, but solid. His. And he didn't do it alone. When he signed the lease, he made sure there was room for Raymond, because if there was one thing Deshawn knew, it was that you didn't forget the people who stood by you when no one else did. He still worked late some nights, still got grease on his hands, still ended his days feeling exhausted, but it was a different kind of tired now. A good kind. The kind that came from earning something real. And the best part, he didn't just have a job. He had people. Vanessa checked in on him from time to time, sending texts that ranged from professional "hope the job's treating you well" to teasing "told you life wasn't done with you yet." Marcus still kept him on his toes, pushing him, expecting more, treating him like someone who had a future instead of just a past. One night, after a long shift, Deshawn sat on his porch, watching the sky darken, listening to the distant hum of the city. Raymond was beside him, sipping a beer, quiet for a while before finally saying, "Didn't think I'd see the day you got yourself a real job." Deshawn smirked. "Didn't think I'd see it either." Raymond let out a chuckle, shaking his head. "Proud of you, man." Deshawn didn't say anything at first, just sat with those words, letting them settle, letting himself believe them. Then, finally, he nodded, taking a slow sip of his own drink. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady, certain. "Me too." And for the first time in his life, he meant it. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.